here in the European Parliament, which is in the heart of Europe. And today we're discussing issues that are affecting not only Europe, but also Israel as well. And one of the main topics of conversation is what is the role of Christians and Jews in defending Israel here in the European Parliament. We'll also be discussing Palestinian human rights abuses and what can the European Union do to ensure that Palestinians have better freedoms and better rights. We'll also be discussing Iran's nuclear program. Is this a real threat, and how can Europe play a greater role in confronting the threat of a nuclear Iran? And third issue we'll be discussing is what are the consequences for Europe's Jewish community after the horrendous attack that took place in Toulouse at a school in southwest France. And to join me today I have experts to really provide insight into these questions. I'm joined today by Rick Ridings of Sukkot Halal. Welcome to the programme. And by Thomas Sandel from the Coalition for European Coalition for Israel, and Caleb Myers from the Jerusalem Institute of Justice. Hello and welcome to the programme.
Thank you for having us.
First of all, Rick, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do so our viewers have an understanding?
Well, we lived here for 12 years in Brussels, and we're involved in a lot of prayer at early stages of some of the things that led to the European Coalition for Israel. And we now have lived for 12 years in Jerusalem, where we lead a 24/7 house of prayer that faces out toward Mount Zion. But we as well work with the development of houses of prayer in the region. So I just returned last week from Turkey, dedicating a new house of prayer and training for people there. 6 houses in Turkey, 2 in Egypt, 3 in Lebanon, 1 in Syria, and 2 in United Arab Emirates. And all of them are praying for Israel, which is a rather interesting development.
Mm-hmm. And Thomas, you're the founder of the European Coalition for Israel, and here we are. It's a youth gathering for young people to get more involved with standing with Israel and the Jewish people. How did the Lord give you this vision, and what is the vision of ECI?
I think the vision is quite simple, that as a European looking back at history in this part of the world, we know that what our fathers and grandfathers didn't manage to do, I think the Lord is calling us to do, and that is to stand up for the Jewish people, especially in times when they are facing persecution, and as we saw only this week, even Jewish small children being killed in Europe. The actual vision came about around the same time as the first UN conference against racism took place in Durban, South Africa. And if you recall, this was September 2001. The next week was September 11. So in terms of timing, it was interesting that we felt the Lord wanted us to step up our efforts to show solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people at such a time. So of course now we've been up and running for more or less 9-10 years, and today is special from many perspectives. One is that we have a young leaders consultation going on here, and first and foremost the fact that we are doing this media coverage now from the European Parliament. So thank you, Simon, for being part of it.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And Caleb, can you tell me something about yourself? Because you're involved in a very, very important work, really, which is groundbreaking work in providing justice, in a sense, and advocating human rights abuses across the Middle East. So can you tell us how you got involved in that and the nature of your organisation and work?
Sure. I have a passion in my heart to advance justice. Justice being becoming a voice for those without a voice. And so within the Israeli society, we do many projects to help people without a voice, to strengthen the democratic character of our state. We do a lot of representation of minority religions. I've done cases before the Supreme Court on behalf of the Messianic Jewish community, the evangelical Christian community within Israel. We've adopted other needy communities with Israel. The Jerusalem Institute of Justice, we have a program that only fights human trafficking. Recently we've made some successful progress on pushing through an anti-prostitution bill for the first time in the history of Israel, which will help to curb the prostitution industry. And we've adopted different communities, lone soldiers, Holocaust survivors, Ethiopian new immigrants, and we give both pro bono legal advocacy for these communities and also some lobbying on at the public level in the Knesset for these projects. But several years ago, we started getting involved in standing up on behalf of Israel in the international human rights community. As a human rights organization, as an organization that challenges the Israeli government on its own civil rights and human rights issues, we have a legitimate voice within the international human rights community, and we notice that most of the international human rights organizations unjustly blame Israel for everything and for many things that it's not actually guilty of. And so, in cooperation with the European Coalition for Israel and many other wonderful organizations, we helped mobilize Christians at the Durban II conference, in which Israel was proclaimed to be an apartheid state. At the Durban III conference in New York City in September of 2011, we also came to advocate on behalf of Gilad Shalit when he was in captivity before the Red Cross. And what's a little bit different about our organization is that we have succeeded in mobilizing evangelical Christians to come before whether it's the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, whether it's the European Parliament, the UN in New York City, to come out en masse and demonstrate on behalf of Israel and do events to help be a voice for Israel. Just like we're a voice for those without a voice within the Israeli society, I see Israel as that entity without a voice in the international community in many ways. It's blamed again for many things unjustly, and it has some major public relations problems that we want to help it deal with.
And Thomas, here we are. I think we're in a very, very significant place here in the European Parliament, which has now become the heart of Europe. And as Europe gets closer together with political and economic integration, we're seeing probably the emergence of soon of a European superstate. And here in Brussels is the powerhouse in Europe. How important is it and how significant is it that Christians should get involved in politics and, more importantly, get involved in standing up for Israel in the European Parliament?
I think it's very significant, and I think most people would agree with me. You don't have to be a Jew or a Christian to agree. Simply looking at European history, we have to go back and see what happened after the Second World War, when the leaders of that day came together and say, how can we build a new type of Europe? How can we avoid conflicts, armed conflicts? And there were basically two pledges made at this time. Well, three pledges. They said, never again will we let down the Jewish people. Never again will we solve our conflicts with arms. We have to find other means. But also concerning the Jewish people, to say, history has taught us that the Jewish people need a state of their own where they can have full safety and security. And these three, and in particular the two pledges made to the Jewish people, are very relevant. And we are here on a weekly basis to remind the decision makers and say, listen, this is what we agreed on in the early days, and the foundation needs to be the same, because Europe as a continent has failed the Jewish people more than any other continents in the world. When I meet with some of my Jewish friends, they refer to Europe as the largest Jewish graveyard in the world. That's not very, very nice thing to hear for me as a European, but it is a reality. And that means that today we have a particular responsibility as non-Jews, as Gentiles, and as Christians to make a difference. So if we would fail to be here where the decisions are taken, I think we would have failed not only Europe, but especially the God of Israel.
And Rick, I mean, a lot of your ministry, or say the majority of your ministry, is centered around prayer and intercession. How important is it that Christians throughout Europe realise that we need to start praying for Europe, we need to start praying for MEPs, members of the European Parliament, for the European Commission, so they have an understanding of what's happening concerning Israel and the Jewish people, and get the true perspective of what's happening in the Middle East?
I believe for too long we've not realised this component, that these two components come together. We've kind of made it either or. Either you do action through political means, through media, or you pray. But they fit together hand in glove. Part of it is praying for those who are doing the political advocacy, who are doing the judicial and legal advocacy, those who are doing media advocacy, to pray for them for divine appointments, to pray for them to come with the right people at the right time, to have avenues and platforms by which they can get this message out. And then part of it is praying for the decision makers themselves, because even if we are not in agreement with them, the Bible said very, very clearly that our first prayer should be to pray for those who are in authority. And Daniel was able to serve under a pagan king in a pagan empire, the heart of Babylon. And yet his key to being able to be a prophetic voice into this evil empire was that he was a man of prayer 3 times a day. His enemies knew that was the only way they could really get at Daniel, was to attack his prayer life. And he, because of his prayer, was able to be a man of wisdom and come with godly wisdom to political rulers. And they began to recognize that wisdom that was coming forth, and they began to listen more and more to his counsel. So I believe there's really a place today for Christians who in prayer will hear the voice of God in such a way and leading them in such a way that they can come at just the right moment with just the right counsel to have a great impact in the political arena.
And Caleb, what sort of response have you received so far from members of the European Parliament, maybe the European Commission, on Palestinian human rights abuses? And can you describe what some of those issues that you're dealing with?
Yeah, we did a report. First of all, it's important to understand that the European Union is the -- 1 and largest donor of funds to the Palestinian Authority. And they have a very clear double standard. Our report systematically reviews the status of human rights in the Palestinian Authority, both in the West Bank and Gaza. We go according to the International Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, which has been adopted by the European Union and all of its member states. We review children's rights and women's rights and religious freedoms and freedom of expression, etc. And we basically find out that the status of these rights is very, very poor, that the average Palestinian citizen lives under a cloud of fear, fear of expressing political opinions, fear of expressing religious opinions, fear of arbitrary arrests and sometimes even torture. And so a complete lack of freedom of expression, no separation of powers, no true democracy. And so the status of human rights in the Palestinian Authority is deplorable. Yet the European Union continues to fund, to donate funds in hundreds of millions of euros to this entity without demanding any true human rights reform. And this is a very clear double standard, because if we look at the way the European Union treats Turkey, for instance, who's tried for several decades to become a member of the European Union, and for the last 6 years there have been in intense negotiations where the Parliament has put forward requests and demands for true human rights reform just to become a member of the Union, which is an irreversible process. At the same time, the EU is pushing for recognition, unilateral recognition of the Palestinian state, which is an irreversible process, and giving all this money. In 2012, we're talking about over 300 million euro to this entity without any human rights demands whatsoever. We see this as a very clear double standard, and it's not helpful to the Palestinian people. The ones who are suffering the most from this situation are the Palestinians themselves, because nobody is standing up and making these requirements. As we've submitted this report today to the Parliament, you asked me what kind of responses we received. So far, we've received very positive responses, probably because the members of Parliament who we've met with are evangelical Christians who support Israel, and they have expressed their determination to leverage this report, to submit it to the Human Rights Council of the European Parliament, to submit it to the Budgetary Committee of the European Parliament, and to do everything they can to lobby on behalf of true human rights reforms for the Palestinians.
And Thomas, we know that since the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, that the European Union is wanting to play a greater role in the Middle East peace process, and particularly building the foundations of a Palestinian state. What are they doing on a grassroots level? Because it seems to be on the grassroots level that's the problem, in preparing the Palestinian people for acceptance of Israel and the Jewish people and acceptance for peace.
I'm afraid that they are not doing enough. And this doesn't seem to be an issue which is really prioritized in Brussels. And as Caleb was just explaining, I think we we have a contradiction that on the one hand they are pushing a process, they are pushing a state building without asking the critical questions that you always should ask for any state to have any form of legality. Given, I mean, it's very clear that without the European money there would be no Palestinian Authority today. But given the fact that we are financing this regime, we have, of course, a great responsibility, not only as taxpayers, to say, well, listen, what are you doing with the tax money? Because Europe is financially, as we all know, in quite a difficult situation. Is this good management of taxpayers' money? But I think even deeper than that, it shouldn't only be a financial consideration, but a moral and an ethical consideration. And if we don't see progress when it comes to respect for human rights and universal values, I don't see it as consistent with our policies to press on with this process. And sadly, to answer your question, I don't think that these type of concerns are being heard loudly enough in this Parliament or in the European Commission, and that's exactly why we are here today, and that's exactly why we will be here next week and in the following weeks.
Yeah, and Rick, it's my impression, certainly since Israel entered into the peace negotiations with Yasser Arafat and PLO, that since Israel withdrew from Judea and Samaria, or known also as the West Bank, we've seen an increase in attacks against Palestinian Christians. Can you maybe share some of the experiences that you know of Palestinian Christians who are suffering for their faith in what is rapidly turning into an Islamized state?
Yes, I was personally in Gaza, visiting with a Christian bookshop there, met a young man named Rami Fayyad. He had two or three children, wonderful young man, had been resilient in the two times that their bookshop was burned down. We were there shortly after one of those burnings. And then we received news about 3 years ago that he had been followed by a group once Hamas came into full power in the Gaza Strip. And they had threatened him time after time. And they were following him, and he called his wife and he said, if I don't come home, you'll know what's happened. And very sadly, they found his body badly beaten to death. And I have another personal friend in Bethlehem, gave his testimony at a youth conference we sponsor every year that has Jewish and Palestinian Arab young people together. And he explained how just because of his testimony for Jesus, he had been beaten almost to death as well in Bethlehem. And the sad thing is that the numbers of Christians who are fleeing is increasing rapidly. Since the PLO took over Bethlehem, the percentage of either traditional or evangelical Christians in Bethlehem has gone from about 80% down to about 20%. Mm-hmm. So that leaves those that are left under even greater pressure and intimidation from the radical Islamic elements around them, who seem to be given quite a great deal of liberty. Were given quite a great deal of liberty once the PLO was in full control of Bethlehem.
Yeah. Kelev, I just want to ask you this question, which should be asked a lot more, but it's not. And this is what I asked in the symposium before this program, is that how can the government, the Palestinian Authority, have international legitimacy and when they enter into a government of national unity with Hamas, and Hamas is prescribed as an international terrorist organisation by the EU, by the United States, by Britain, even by the UN. And within the Hamas Charter, they call for the destruction of the State of Israel and calling for genocide against the Jewish people that results in is the same equivalent to Nazism. How is this not taken seriously here in the heart of European decision-making?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. It's really a rhetorical question. These things should be taken very seriously. Most Europeans don't know what it's like to have somebody else deny their existence. But me, as an Israeli Jewish citizen, we have these organizations and these people, this government, the Palestinian Authority, that denies my very existence, my right to exist. that's problematic, and it's very difficult to do business with somebody like that. It's certainly impossible to make any agreement with somebody that denies our very right to exist. And so the international community has to step up and put pressure on the Palestinian Authority, particularly the European Parliament, that's sending hundreds of millions of euro per year in order to demand true human rights, democratic reform, with the hopes that we actually will have a partner to speak with eventually. But right now, continuing to not only recognize, to give legitimacy to, but also to fund this entity that denies our right to exist is a terrible double standard.
And Thomas, I just want to bring you on at this point. It seems crazy here that the European Union is actually funding the Palestinian Authority when element of that government is Hamas, who are committed to terrorism against Israel and still in a state of terrorism where they still refuse to recognise Israel's right to exist. I'd love your comments on this issue.
Well, I think if we start with the good news, I think the good news is that Hamas was blacklisted here a number of years ago. That was not anything that we could have taken for granted, as we know that Hezbollah did not come on the same list in the same way. So, and I think this will help us tremendously even today, because we can go back to agreements which were repeated also in this parliament today to say, well, this is what the international community has agreed on. And Hamas are certainly not meeting those standards. But the interesting thing is what MEP Hannu Takkula said earlier today. He said that there are basically two groups of people. There are those who really don't know, but there are also those who don't want to know. And I think the more difficult group is, of course, those who really don't want to know, because it makes life more complicated. And we, of course, have to address both groups, and especially those who don't have the information. And we do see, time and time again, how, I think Kalev said it earlier today, the truth will set you free. Once you present people with clear facts, they will start thinking, they will start reasoning. And if they don't get it right away, eventually and gradually they will start to see the light. So I believe it's important that we do stress that we can make a difference. This is not a terrible place. As Rick said, all these people are here because they've been elected, and we believe we have a responsibility to pray for them, but also to befriend them and to be in dialogue with them. This is what democracy is all about. But I think in Europe we have too many times failed to ask the difficult questions, and now it's time that we bring also those to the table.
Yeah. And Rick, what's your perception? Here you live in Jerusalem. You probably have more of a sense of the threats that Israel has to deal with, particularly from the groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, even from Iran, for example. Why is there seem to be an understanding in Europe that they're blinkered on this issue, that they don't see Hamas and Hezbollah as dangerous terrorist organisations that are committed to genocide and destruction of Jewish people?
I think part of it is a naivety that it refuses to acknowledge, as Tomas said, the fact that a large part of the Muslim community has very clearly said that they are willing to do whatever it would take to eradicate Israel off of the face of the map. And in the Cold War era, they had something called doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD. And it basically meant that both of the groups culturally knew that if they were the first one to fire a nuclear weapon, the other group could get them back, and they would just destroy each other. So that was an incentive not to use nuclear weapons. And so they're applying, I think, many this same principle to Ahmadinejad today, saying, well, he can't really mean what he's saying. Surely he's exaggerating, and surely he would want to save the people of Iran from destruction and would not use a nuclear weapon even if he had it. But the fact is that if you look at the history of this man and of those who are working with him, their mentality is basically that of a suicide bomber. Only now you have the potential of a nation that becomes a suicide bomber. Not that all the people of Iran would want that, but that the leader would be willing to sacrifice his nation if he knew he had somehow done the ultimate great deed for his religion of destroying the Jewish people and their state.
And Thomas, probably the biggest foreign policy of an issue today in our generation is that of a nuclear-armed Iran, which would seriously change the whole security dynamics in the Middle East. Are European leaders aware of the real danger of Iran if they succeed in developing nuclear weapons? And we know that the EU has plans to impose a full oil embargo on Iranian crude oil. Do you believe this will be an effective deterrent in preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons?
Well, to answer your first question, I think that increasingly the leaders are aware of what we are facing. We just had presidential elections in Finland, my home country, and this became one of the key issues, and all the candidates said that this is the major issue that we are facing today. So to answer your question, yes. Will the European sanctions really stop Iran from acquiring nuclear capabilities? I don't think that we have taken all the measures that we should have taken at this point. And I know that there's a capacity and a willingness within the European community as well to go further. That's very clear. My concern has been the fact that there are voices who would say openly, try to advise Israel on a certain path, say, well, don't do this, don't, go unilaterally. And whereas I'm not a foreign policy expert when it comes to these issues, I think what we need to send as a message from Europe is to say, listen, whatever steps Israel will take, we will back them up. And I think only this message, which is to say that there is a unified Western world, there's a unified union of moral nations who will stand by Israel no matter what, even if it would take the Israel to deal with the situation on their own. So here I think what both the European Parliament needs to do and what the member states of the EU needs to do is to be firm, committed, don't waver, don't speculate, but just say, listen, this threat is a threat also to Europe and any other peace-loving country, and to quote Prime Minister Aznar, if Israel falls, we all fall, but together we will stand in solidarity with Israel. Iran needs to hear this message. The whole world community needs to hear it loud and clear.
You know the realities in the Middle East because you live there, you understand them. What are the implications of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, and how will this change the whole balance of power in the Middle East?
As an Israeli, the threat of Iranian terrorism is not just a theoretical idea. Today they're funding terrorism. Today they're funding the Hamas and the Hezbollah that are lobbing Qassam rockets and Scud missiles into our civilian population. The same regime that's funding these terrorist organizations today openly declares that they think that the Zionist entity should be removed from the map of the world. One thing that we learned as the Jewish people from World War II is that if a leader stands up and declares his intent to destroy you, believe what he says. And so I'm very happy as an Israeli citizen that it appears that our Prime Minister and our government is taking this threat very seriously and keeping all options on the table. And I'm very supportive of that. We hope that the military option is not something that will need to take place. We hope that the sanctions of the international community will bear fruit. But if they don't, then we probably won't have a choice. And unfortunately, that's the situation. And so we do need the prayers of the Christian community. We just celebrated recently the holiday of Purim. And Purim was nothing more, nothing less than the celebration of the miraculous victory of an ancient Iranian regime that had similar goals to eradicate the Jewish people from the face of the earth. But we had divine intervention, and so we're hoping today, again, with the help of Christian friends and throughout Europe, that once again we'll stand strong. We believe that we have the right not only to exist but to thrive in the land of Israel, and that's what we hope to see.
And Rick, looking at this, and many of our Christian viewers who don't really engage in politics, how real and how dangerous is this threat from Iran, not only to Israel but also to the Western world?
I think, it's very important to realize that it is not limited just to Israel. Israel is really on the front lines of the battle for the survival of Judeo-Christian society and civilization. And that in the lands I travel in the Arab world, I realize that the general sentiment that is coming forth in most of the Islamic media is strongly that they must really kind of get rid of this little Satan and the great Satan behind it. They really see us as a threat to their way of life and as a threat to their religion. And there are a lot of, peace-loving Muslims who I know, but unfortunately the ones I know who are peace-loving are those that don't really follow their book and don't really follow their religion. But if you really follow what it says, if you really are committed to following its teachings, it sets up an inevitable conflict where they must bring the whole world into submission, either by violence, either by coercion, but if that doesn't work, then by violence or annihilation, which is what happened historically from Muhammad on. He did not really spread his religion peacefully. He spread his religion by forcing people to either recant their belief in the Jewish God or in the Christian God, who is the same God, or they were faced with death. And we just need to realize this same dynamic, spiritual dynamic, is really at work. We can't just close our eyes and hope it will all go away. It's a very real threat to every nation of Europe and to the United States as well as to Israel.
Yeah. And Thomas, the British Prime Minister David Cameron made a recent statement in Parliament where he raised concern that the Iranians are developing intercontinental ballistic missiles that are capable of reaching Europe. Now, doesn't this mean that Europe has to take a stronger stance? And if military action is required to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, then Europe needs to take a stronger approach in dealing with the Iranian regime.
I think it's clear, and there's no secret where we stand, that, as Kalev said, all options should be on the table. We are not a militarist organization, so we are not commenting or making suggestions to anyone here in Brussels on what path they should take. But simply to state the obvious, we cannot rule out any option. But I believe it's, as I said, I believe it's very important that we show a unified front, that we don't try to play out one nation against another, or we try to downplay, to say, well, this is only Israel, why should we again have new problems because of Israel? And here I think the elected members have a responsibility also to explain to their constituencies, because what we will see, and I'm afraid that this may be a scenario in Europe, if, God forbid, it would come to a military showdown, you can just imagine what the ramifications would be in Europe. And not only that, there are already reports and calculations which are showing the financial cost of putting Iran completely into a boycott. And I think it was the case of Germany that they said they would lose 10,000 jobs per year in putting Iran in a complete trade boycott. So I hear this from time to time in this parliament. I mean, these are people who need to be re-elected, and these are tough decisions to take, and we need to honor and respect and understand it. It's not an easy yes or no, but it does take courage, and it takes moral clarity to look reality in the eye and say, well, this is where we are now. Things in 1938 didn't get any better by just saying, well, this is a tough one. And I don't think Churchill is quoted often enough in this parliament to really get the message through.
Yeah. And Kalev, the implications of Iran having nuclear weapons were made very, very clear by the recent speech by your Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to AIPAC, the American Public Affairs Committee, in which he described that Iran with nuclear weapons could bring economic devastation and hold the whole Western world to ransom by threatening to close the Straits of Hormuz, by threatening Saudi Arabia, which could then spur a proliferation of nuclear weapons in the region, which is currently the most volatile region in the world, compounded by the fact that Saudi Arabia, Egypt and other Sunni states would want to acquire nuclear weapons, which makes the scenario of nuclear material getting into the hands of terrorists that are affiliated to the Iranian regime very likely. We could see a dirty bomb in Paris, Brussels or London, a real possibility. Is the world really, really aware of the true nature and the genocidal tendencies of this Iranian regime? And do you believe there is the political will, particularly from the United States and Europe, to confront what is the biggest foreign policy challenge of our generation?
That's a very good question. I'm encouraged by the fact that the European Union made the courageous decision to shut down the SWIFT bank accounts to help cripple Iran's trade. It seems like this happened after Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to the United States, where he clearly convinced the world that if all sanctions fail, then we won't have a choice but to protect the security of our state through every option. So that was an excellent decision. If the message has gotten deep enough, only time will tell, and I certainly hope so.
Yeah, and Rick, I just really want to bring you on this issue, because on the one hand we're looking at Iran almost on the brink of acquiring nuclear weapons. They are the #1 sponsor of international terrorism around the world, and yet the church is growing at a tremendous rate, the underground church in Iran. And surely that's the actual strategy that the EU need to be pursuing, is how can they support the Iranian people who are opposed to the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Yeah, I think we need to realize that a huge amount of the Iranian people are very dissatisfied with their leadership. But as Caleb said about the Palestinian people who don't have a voice against the human rights abuses in their regime, the same thing is true of the Iranians. They don't have a voice. So we need to be a voice for them. We need to be praying for it, encouraging Iranian believers who are scattered in the nations. We need to be praying for those who are on the ground in Iran. And I believe we need to be praying as well for a merciful intervention of God, that the Iranian leadership would make some strategic errors. I think we see from the example of Queen Esther and Mordecai that prayer was a mighty weapon to shift a situation very similar to that in which the Jewish people of Israel are finding themselves today, the possibility of extermination. And yet it was united prayer and fasting which shifted that situation, and suddenly Haman was hanging upon his own gallows. And I think we need to realize that this needs to be a clear focus in prayer right now of the entire evangelical Christian community worldwide, because it is the most serious issue of our time.
And Thomas, I really want to draw your comments onto another issue, really, and that's the issue of anti-Semitism. I mean, this week we've seen the hideous and horrific attack on Jewish school children in the Jewish school in Toulouse in the southwest of France. Is European leaders aware of the growing rise of anti-Semitism on this continent?
I don't think they are, sadly. I recall having a discussion with representatives from the department or the part of the Commission who is dealing with this particular issue, and I said, "So what are you doing to to combat anti-Semitism?" And they were looking at me as if I was coming from a different planet, and they said, "You mean there's anti-Semitism?" I said, "Yes, I do think there's anti-Semitism," and so I believe there is a real dilemma of not getting the message. And see, again, what we're not discussing now is the role of media. And sometimes, as you know, being in media yourself, media is much more powerful than the political elite. So the way that media would twist around any incident of anti-Semitism in Europe today is to downplay it, not to mention the Jewish component. And politically, how it plays out is always, if you say A, you need to say B. So if you mention the J word in this parliament, you also have to mention another word to get the balance. And this way, unfortunately, by media being unclear, by the political class being unclear, the message is not heard. And I just hope and pray that what happened a few days ago in Toulouse will be something like which would wake us up. And we made a press release where we said that Europe is in a very sad state where Jewish children can no longer live, in peace. And especially looking back where Europe was one generation ago, how did we ever get to this stage? I often start my presentations about the ECI by saying, isn't it interesting? You come into a city like Brussels, you see a particular building which is guarded like it was the Pentagon, and you ask the question to the taxi driver, what's this? And I say, this is the Jewish kindergarten of Brussels. Why on earth would a kindergarten with small children need this type of security? Yeah. And I think the problem in a nutshell is right there, visually, very clear for everyone who wants to see. But we have an obligation to tell the truth and show these facts like we did today.
Yeah. And Kalev, doesn't this again represent a dark chapter in Europe's history, that again Jewish people are being targeted and assassinated in such a horrific way, but this is children, Jewish children, innocent children who are just targeted because they're Jewish. How does that make you feel as a Jew and also an Israeli?
I think this is a very grave situation, and I was personally outraged by the comments made by some members of the European Parliament after the tragedy in Toulouse, where they compared this to the death of a Palestinian girl in Gaza who unfortunately got in the way of an Israeli missile recently. The reason that girl was killed in Gaza, unfortunately, was in the protection and self-defense of Israel, because Hamas terrorists from Gaza are shooting rockets at our innocent civilian population, and they are purposely using children as shields, knowing that if they surround themselves with children and women, it'll be very difficult for us to retaliate and to take them out. In our last engagement in Gaza, during the Cast-led war, when there were buildings that Hamas militants were shooting out of, they would put women and children on the roofs of the buildings, hoping that an Israeli missile, either the Israeli planes would fly over and not want to bomb the building because the women and children are there, or in the worst case scenario, if the building was bombed, then they would bring all the pictures of the dead women and children to the international media and make Israel look terrible. This is not a reciprocal situation that you can look at. The reason that the children and the one parent was killed in Toulouse, they were killed because they're Jewish. Period. And the fact that Jews once again are being killed for being Jewish in Europe is not being taken seriously, or is being compared to this war scenario of self-defense in Gaza, is of grave concern. And I think this is a real wake-up call to the leadership of Europe to take anti-Semitism seriously once again, to crack down on anti-Semitic speech. It usually starts with words. It starts with speech, and that becomes a slippery slope. And when anti-Semitic talk is not addressed and penalized, then it turns into actions, and that's what we've seen recently.
Yeah. And Rick, as Christians, don't we have a moral responsibility to stand up and confront anti-Semitism and to show the Jewish people and to show Israel that we're there, we're standing with you and we're supporting you?
I think the question we need to ask ourselves, if we don't do it, who will?
Yes.
And we owe a great debt, the Bible says, to the Jewish people for preserving the scriptures through the centuries at great risk and at great cost, for preserving the knowledge of the God that we worship. And even our Savior, the Lord Jesus himself, was Jewish. And so we owe a great debt to the Jewish people. And unfortunately, we out of fear, intimidation, backed off in the time of Hitler. And it could have been such a different story if the church had just arisen, if they'd all been like a Dietrich Bonhoeffer and willing to risk their life and willing to stand up and in one united way been a voice for the Jewish people. That horrible destruction of life of 6 million Jewish people could have been avoided, but they did not.
Yeah.
But we have a chance in our generation to make right what our forefathers, unfortunately, where they dropped the ball. We need to rise up to it and realize this is our opportunity to save thousands, if not millions, of people if we will arise and speak with a strong voice now and not wait until it's too late.
Yeah. And Rick, isn't this really, by defending Israel and defending the Jewish people against anti-Semitism, actual fact what we're actually doing is preserving our Judean Christian heritage, and how that Israel and the Jewish people are on the front line, and what happens first when the Jewish people are attacked is the Christians who are attacked afterwards, and the consequences are pretty horrific. So isn't it a duty of every Christian really to confront anti-Semitism for the sake not only of the Jewish people but of our entire Judean Christian heritage?
Yes, I believe if we see the bigger picture, we will realize it is a real matter of the heritage which we have received. But I would hope that we would go beyond our kind of a selfish motivation, and that we would realize, first of all, we need to honor those who have given so much to us and from whom we have received so much. And we need to honor them and love them and stand with them. And we need to make right the wrongs of not just the Holocaust, but hundreds and hundreds of years of people who call themselves Christians, and yet were involved in either the expulsion or the death of Jewish people in communities all across Europe. And this is our opportunity to make a new start and to say we will not be arrogant toward our Jewish roots, as Paul says in Romans 11, but we will honor them, we will pray for them, we will love them, we give to them, we will stand with them, we will let them know that we really appreciate all that we have received from them as a people.
Kelev, what's your reaction to Baroness's comments? I know you alluded to it earlier, but Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, your Prime Minister, really said that her comments actually support terrorism in the Middle East. And how is this helping Israel to engage with the European Parliament at such a high level when you have someone like Baroness Ashton who doesn't really understand the full implications of what's happening in the Middle East?
Yeah, I agree with Prime Minister Netanyahu's assessment of the situation. I was horrified by the comments of Baroness Ashton. Let's just look at it just purely from the human level, not the geopolitical level. When small children are gunned down in cold blood, that's not the time to be making geopolitical comparisons of any sort whatsoever. What about just the expression of sadness and comforting the families that have gone through this terrible loss, as well as the whole Jewish community that's shell-shocked right now in Toulouse, and dealing with these memories of persecution that took place on this continent within the last century, and is this a new wave of anti-Semitic murders that we're going to see throughout Europe? I mean, this is a very, very, very difficult time that this community and this family is going through, and so to make such a harsh geopolitical comparison to somehow use this as a way to attack Israel was very insensitive and uncalled for. I think it was a horrific statement, and I also agree with Thomas that it was a shame that she didn't accept our invitation and come to the event today as to clarify her stance on these issues.
And I think we're on to a real final 5 minutes of the programme. I'll start off with you, Kelev. How important is it that Christians get behind and mobilise and support Israel and the Jewish people at this very critical hour of world history?
I think that it's impossible to overstate the importance of the Christian support of Israel. I think that Israel is becoming more and more aware of the fact, me as an Israeli citizen, are becoming more and more aware of the fact that besides the evangelical Christian Bible-believing community, we don't have too many friends left in the world as a Jewish community. 60 plus years have gone by since the Holocaust. We don't have that same emotional reaction. We're a few generations removed. Unfortunately, the collective memory of the world is very short, and so once again, Israel is being isolated and condemned, and the only community that's systematically standing up and speaking out on our behalf, including organizations like the European Coalition for Israel and Thomas and Sukkot Hallel, are organizations run by evangelical Christians who have this appreciation for the Judeo-Christian heritage and the importance of supporting Israel. So it's impossible to overstate everything that evangelical Christians can do to stand up on behalf of the Jewish people in Israel. I believe is essential today.
And Thomas, I mean, what a privilege we have in our day, really, to stand with Israel and the Jewish people and to maybe rewrite some of the wrongs that took place on this continent over 60 years ago.
I remember when we were launched, there was a statement made. I didn't make the statement, so I can quote it, which made a comparison again going back to the 30s and the 40s. And this particular person said what was lacking in the 30s and the 40s was an infrastructure, logistics, a united voice. Because, as Rick mentioned, there was a Dietrich Bonhoeffer, there was a Corrie ten Boom, there were others, Raoul Wallenberg, who did things, but they were isolated. And I believe the way that we can make a difference is that we work together. We work together all across the European Union, and then we are here in the heart where the decisions are taken, and we are being heard, we are raising our voices. This did not happen in the 30s, it did not happen in the 40s. And I believe as much as it is an optimistic sign, it is a call for everyone, and I would say beyond being an evangelical Christian, anyone of goodwill just to join and say, listen, when the history books are written next time, let there be another type of chapter of what non-Jews and what Christians did in Europe when the Jewish people were facing a difficult time. And this is the chapter that we are writing here in Brussels right now together with all the three of you.
And Rick, I just really want to bring you on this one. I mean, how important is it that Christians stand with Israel and the Jewish people? And, you're based in Jerusalem. You see so many Christians come and visit Israel. What difference does it make?
Maybe I could answer that with I was at a dinner and we were seated at a table with the sister of a former prime minister. And she said, honestly, with all I heard in my growing up years about what Christians had done through the centuries to the Jewish people, I had a great hatred in my heart toward Christians and a great fear of them, that they would betray us again. But she said, I must say, after the last 10 years, I have met Christian group after Christian group who has come to this nation to stand with Israel. Especially, she said, when I see people like you who stayed here through the Intifada, through the bus bombings, and you were here with us and standing with us and praying for us, and encouraging us, I realize now there really are Christians who are true friends to the Jewish people and to Israel. And she said, it's shifting my feeling about Christians. So this is, excuse me, this is a very strategic moment to be able to, sorry, this is a very strategic moment for Christians to really be able to make a difference to the Jewish community.
And I think we're down to the last few minutes. So have you got a message, each one of you, for our viewers about the significance of being here in the European Parliament and making a real stand for Israel and the Jewish people? I'll start off with Thomas.
Yeah, we have just celebrated Purim, or at least in the Jewish world it has been celebrated, and I think the message is very clear. It's almost a non-religious message, because the name of God is not mentioned once, to my understanding, in the book of Esther, but still Esther made the difference in saving the Jewish people from destruction. And I believe sometimes what I like to see from my Christian friends throughout Europe is also to get your hands a little bit dirty. And yes, to prayer, and we are a prayer-driven ministry, but also to take action, to get involved, to speak with your elected members of parliament, to work together with like-minded people across Europe. If we do that, I'm confident that we can make a difference.
And Caleb?
Yeah, what I like so much about what Thomas is doing at the European Coalition for Israel, and he talks right now, he quoted from Esther, where the name of God is never mentioned, but you can clearly see a divine hand orchestrating events. You're probably not going to convince your politician, whether it's in Great Britain or Finland or Belgium, to support Israel through theological arguments. But coming back to the very basic issues and using the language that is so acceptable in our day and age regarding human rights, regarding democracy, regarding freedom, personal freedoms, and looking at reality through those lenses, like the Human Rights Report that we've put on the table of the European Union, challenging their double standard of, putting Turkey to the test of human rights levels up here, and the Palestinian Authority being completely ignored while giving all this money, asking the difficult questions, saying, me as a European taxpayer, seeing all this money going to the Palestinian Authority, a terrible abuser of human rights, when we're going through this terrible economic recession in Europe. These are the questions that need to be asked, and I agree with Thomas that people just need to become politically active, ask the right questions in the right language, and be used like Esther to make a difference on behalf of the God of Israel, without ever having to necessarily quote Scripture or jump into theology.
Yeah. And Rick, I'll just give you the final word on the programme. This is a wonderful opportunity that we have here in the European Parliament to really stand with Israel and the Jewish people in prayer and also in practical support.
I believe, Jesus said very clearly that we were to be salt and to be light. And I think in that he was trying to say, don't look at your numbers. Don't look at when you feel so weak and so small and say, well, what can I do? It only takes a little bit of salt to change the taste of something. It only takes a little bit of light and darkness to make a great impact. So he's saying, don't look at your numbers. Look to the greatness of your God and step out and make a difference. And I think it's wonderful in this time that we're seeing this marriage of these two aspects of prayer and social action, that it isn't an either or question. But praise God, there's a generation like yourself, like Olive, that are rising up, that are saying these things all belong together, and the kingdom of God is meant to be that tiny mustard seed that grows into a giant tree. It is meant to be that yeast that leavens the whole lump of dough, and we can make a difference through our prayers and through our actions, and we can be salt and light.
Yeah. And I just want to thank you all for watching this special programme here from in the heart of Europe, in the European Parliament. And we have a real opportunity to stand with Israel and the Jewish people. And let's make sure that Europe has a new history, a history of confronting anti-Semitism, a history of confronting radical extremism and defending liberty, freedom and democracy here in the heart of Europe.